Okay, welcome yet again today to Ethics and Leadership. Today we're moving on to the second of the great philosophers that we're going to be talking about, the philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle was a student of Plato's, but one of the things that hopefully you're picking up through your reading is that Aristotle didn't always agree with Plato on everything. And Plato had a lot of insights, but in some ways Aristotle, I think, actually trumps Plato. He understands a little bit more, although it'll go back and forth in the history of ethics about which one of them was right. In some ways, the two of them, between Aristotle and Plato, lay out some of the major positions that are going to be fought for the next several thousand years and even to today. So it's worthwhile to take a moment then to start and look at Aristotle. Now, the reading that you have is from the Nicomachean Ethics. The book actually claims that Aristotle named this after his father. The author of the book is wrong. It was named after Aristotle's son, who had the same name as his father. He named his son after his father, and then he named the book after his son, which was named after his father. But they didn't actually name the book after his father. It's really not important, but just in case you wanted to know. One of the greatest books in ethics in the history of human civilization. It really is an extraordinary work. I want to highlight here where there are overlaps and disagreements with Plato in Aristotle. Hopefully you're picking up on a lot of this stuff in the discussion, and we're kind of picking this out. The first thing is that both of them think about ethics very similarly in terms of the good life, or in terms of what we might call teleology. Teleology has to do with telos, the goal, the purpose of things. And ethics is fulfilling the purpose of things. So both of them use the exact same analogy to the eye, and they talk about virtue being the quality of the eye that allows the eye to function. And of course the function, the telos, the goal of the eye is to see. And so the virtue of the eye is the proper formation of the eye. And then they agree that the good for the human being is going to be the telos of the human being, that it functions properly. However, they disagree significantly on what proper functioning looks like. If you will recall, for Plato, the greatest telos of the human being was to gain kind of abstract knowledge. The person who comes out of the cave and goes out and sees the sun and looks at it directly, right? And gains the knowledge, the abstract knowledge through contemplation and understanding of things. You can kind of imagine Plato's ideal as the person sitting around and just meditating on an idea. Now, this is why, one of the reasons at least, why for Plato, the leader has to be forced to come back and do anything practical in leading other people. Because the leader would much rather be sitting and contemplating or thinking about some abstract idea. But for Aristotle, things are different. Aristotle pointedly disagrees with Plato on this picture of what the good life is. He says, look, everybody thinks that the good is eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is a Greek word that Plato could also use. But eudaimonia, he says, is something like happiness. It is proper functioning. It is fullness of life. The fullness of life. And you don't just get the fullness of life by sitting and contemplating on an idea. You get the fullness of life only by living a life with friends, with good things, good food, all of these goods that are around you that are much more than just the ideas that you would focus on. It's not that the good life cannot just be about gaining knowledge. It can't just be about that. And Plato is just wrong in how he has conceived of the good life. Now this will be important for our next reading, when we start thinking about luck and the role luck plays in the good life. And the role luck plays then in shaping leaders and shaping the people that we think of as leaders in society. So we'll come back to that, a very, very important idea. In the meantime, I also want to take up, probably more importantly for this one, the differences between the Plato and Aristotle and their views of virtue. And you might think about this, so I suggested that for Plato, a virtue is a kind of right ordering of the person. Now, you could say the same for Aristotle. We can get it to work out that way. But I think much more for Aristotle, it makes sense to think about virtue as a quality of the character of the person. A quality of the character of the person. Now again, this overlaps and diverges from what Plato would say. He agrees with Plato that a virtue is a quality that helps you fulfill your telos, or a quality that helps you do what you're supposed to do in your proper functioning. But he disagrees with Plato in a couple of areas here. Number one is that abstract knowledge is enough to have virtue. So for Plato, in some ways, knowing the order of the self was enough to have the good ordering of the self. To know it in the abstract was to want it, and that was sufficient for you. To know the form of the good is to want the form of the good, and there is no distinction between these two things. Whereas Aristotle's not really convinced by this. He doesn't think that to know about something, say, for instance, it might be that you know you shouldn't eat the pizza, and yet, Aristotle says, you still want to go ahead and eat the pizza. For Plato, that doesn't really make sense. You can't really know and still want to do something even though it's bad for you. And Aristotle is much more subtle here in his picture of how human beings work. He says, no. Sometimes we know something's bad for us, and yet we still go ahead and do it. We haven't yet shaped ourselves properly. So abstract knowledge is not enough to have virtue. And second, if this is true, if abstract knowledge is not enough, we need something more than contemplation to get to true virtue. Because just thinking about it and just coming to abstract knowledge will not be enough to get us to actually act properly. And virtue is all about getting us to act properly. We're going to need something more than contemplation. A third point on which they diverge from each other, at least in emphasis, is this. Plato, you will recall, had the image of the reason as driving the chariot, where the spirits or the emotions and the desires or the appetites were the horses. And so reason just controlled these things. It pushed them around, right? They were almost irrational parts of the self that the reason just controlled. But for Aristotle, there's much more give and take between these. He thinks that emotions and desires have to kind of cooperate with reason. That in some places, reason will actually be informed by desires about what's good. So the fact that you desire food might actually tell your reason that food is something good for you. Now, desire might get out of control, that's true. But desire by itself isn't a problem. It isn't just an irrational thing. It's actually rational. It actually functions. And so there's a cooperation. He talks at times about training your desires or training your emotions rather than just controlling your desires or controlling your emotions. You have to train them. You have to bring all of this, the reason and the emotions and the desires, into harmony with each other. And it's the point at which you want to do what you know to be right, that you're in harmony with yourself. So oftentimes we aren't in harmony with ourselves. We're in trouble because our desires and our emotions and our reasons disagree about what to do. But really, we need to get them all to cooperate towards this one goal. And to do that, we're going to see it takes some work. The third point, and here at Aristotle we can see the work that Aristotle is doing to try and coordinate desires and reasons. He says that the virtue is the mean between extremes when dealing with the moral virtues. The virtue is the mean between the extremes. And here he means that there will be emotions that you have. Say the emotion of fear that you have to deal with. And fear itself is not just this irrational thing. Sometimes it's helpful, right? There are things that you're appropriately afraid of. If you come down a dark alley and there's a huge dog, you are appropriately afraid of the huge dog, right? And your fear might inform your reason and lead you to, in fact, back off from the dog when it's appropriate. But it depends what kind of a dog it is. If it's a little chihuahua, you probably shouldn't be that afraid of it, right? So your reason's also going to have to inform your fear, and these two things are going to have to go back and forth. And so he says the virtue is the mean between the extremes when you're dealing with your emotions here. The virtue is the mean between the extremes. It's not being too afraid, and it's not being not afraid enough, right? On the one hand, the person that's too afraid we call a coward, right? On the other hand, the person who's not afraid enough we call foolhardy or an idiot, who's just going to run out imagine somebody who's just not afraid to go across the street, right? This person is just an idiot, or they're foolhardy if there's a whole bunch of cars coming down the street at high speed. So the thing is, we have to find the mean between the extremes. And the mean between the extremes, is what Aristotle calls the virtue. So courage is it's not cowardice, and it's not foolhardiness. Courage, the person who runs out in front of the speeding cars is not courageous, he's an idiot, right? The person who just sits back and is never able to cross the street because they're afraid of the cars, that person is a coward. And so between those two is where you find the virtue, the harmony between the desires and the reason that allows the person to function properly, says Aristotle. Okay, so then the question is, how do we gain virtue? And hopefully you've picked some of this up from the reading. The thing is this: we can't just gain virtue by learning about it. We can't just gain virtue by contemplating it and coming to the abstract ideas. What we have to do is we have to practice. In some ways, Aristotle sees being a good person much like being good at a particular sport. So you can imagine the person who wants to be good at football or be good at basketball or something like this, right? And so the person doesn't just read a book about this, doesn't just sit around and think about football all the time. There are lots of people who think about all these things, and that doesn't make them good at it, right? And so Aristotle says if you want to be a good person, what you need to practice being a good person. Because what this will do is, this will shape, your emotions get shaped by this, your passions get shaped by this, your desires get shaped by it. If you can imagine, like right now, imagine that you could go out and you could help a homeless person. You could go out and feed a hungry person. But right now, this wouldn't make you very happy. It would distract you. It would make you annoyed and do all these kind of negative things. But you think, a good person would want to go out and help these people. A good person would want to go out and share with these people. Then what Aristotle says is go out and do it until you like it. Right? Go out and do it until your desires, your emotions are shaped such that you're the right kind of person. And in some ways, this is the same advice that you give to the basketball player who isn't quite good. Imagine the guy who's not quite good at moving through the lanes, right? You go out and you do it enough until you kind of feel proper about it. You don't always, when you play a sport, you don't always think through what you're doing. Oftentimes it's done on the basis of feeling about it. And this is where Aristotle wants people to get. This is when you're truly the good person, is when you've practiced enough that you feel correct about it, that you just immediately want to do the good thing, right? So you need to practice. A third part, though, is how do you know what to practice? I mean, practice makes perfect, but only if you're practicing the right thing. If I go out and just practice basketball with myself or with the other faculty here at Central Methodist University, the chances are I will not get a lot better at basketball because I don't know what I'm doing, or not much of what I know I need to throw the ball, but I don't know exactly what I'm doing, right? So I would have to practice with a bunch of people who knew something about what they were doing. I would need to find people who are good at playing basketball, right? And so this is exactly the same advice that Aristotle gives us with regards to how to become a good person. Find those sages, right, in the society, those people who are recognized as good people, and do what they do. This should set you up for being a good person. Now, finding the sages, you have to rely upon the society. You have to rely upon the society because this is what teaches you who the good people are. You learn this by looking around and looking at people that are respected, that are lauded. So, for instance, Mother Teresa is a person who, in general society, recognized as a good person, right? you would have to look around. And it depends what culture you're in, exactly who you're going to end up imitating, right? One particular part of our culture might believe that the president is a great person, but another part of our culture won't. So it depends what part of culture you participate in, exactly who you're going to end up imitating. This is one of the common critiques of Aristotle, is that there's not enough specifics there. Although I think he's probably right in how this actually works. So how does this work out in terms of leadership? There's a couple of things that we can definitely draw from Aristotle at this point. One is, what should the leader do? Well, clearly in Aristotle, you can't divide your life into multiple different parts and say, oh, when I'm involved in business, that's what I'm just going to do, what's required there, right? You have to exemplify being the good person. You have to become a sage to be a good leader, because others are going to be following you. They are going to be looking at you and imitating you. And so if you want to have a good company, if you want to have a good whatever, you have to act like the person that you want your followers to act like, right? You can't be simply focused on the bottom line if you want the people in your company to be morally upstanding. Now, if you're only focused on the bottom line, the people in your company will probably only be focused on the bottom line, according to Aristotle. And if that's the case, right, they will be as loyal to you as you are to them, which the chances are there won't be a lot of loyalty there. So you've got to be an example of what you want. That's a central role for the leader. The other thing that the leader has to do is the leader has to shape society. So as much as possible, the leader needs to use the rules in society to shape how people's lives are, what kinds of things they value, because this shapes who they end up imitating, and the ruler actually has the ruler of society has an obligation here to shape people properly, to set them up so that they observe the right people and they act the right way and they become virtuous, and so that they have the opportunity to become virtuous. And we'll come back to that in the last section on Aristotle when I provide a lecture. It's a bit more on Aristotle's politics. But at least this gives us some place to start. So next we will go to a little discussion about the role of luck in the moral life, and specifically in Aristotle's way of thinking about the moral life. I'll see you then.